Добрий день, дуже радий вітати вас і хочу представити.
I would like to introduce our guest, Alan Mendoza. He's a founder of the Society of Henry Jackson. That is the society that is a study center in the UK. He will tell you about his work, and he will focus on the issue of foreign policy of the West in the time of uncertainty. And he will connect that to the situation in Ukraine.
Alan Mendoza, he is the founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. He will speak about the Western foreign policy at the times of uncertainty, and he will address various issues and the wars which are now going on in the world and how it is related to the current Russia-Ukraine relations and the general political environment in Europe in this context. So without much further ado, Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Vasil. Very good to be here in Kiev today and to actually see for myself for the first time the growing democracy happening here, the movement, the change that I think is incumbent for all Europeans to learn more about, Americans, and to see how we can assist in that process. But I've chosen to speak about the idea of Western foreign policy today, and indeed how this plays into this particular crisis here, because unfortunately there is no shortage of crises in foreign policy today which are impacting upon the West's ability to intervene here, to support your government and all those who favour freedom here in Ukraine as we face a confluence of crises that indeed distract our attention. And first and foremost among those, something you've obviously been aware of here as well because you're in a similar position, is economic crisis. Now it is true that in Britain and America we are now coming out of that crisis caused by the financial collapse in 2008. But it's been a long and painful process. I mean, we have seen GDP falls, we've seen growth only restored this year to sort of pre-crash levels, and that has an impact psychologically, I think, on how we view the world, and particularly on our willingness to be involved in foreign policy decisions that might lead us into conflict in one way or another. And I think in many ways it's been miraculous that we haven't seen more crises in this time of Western enfeeblement in foreign policy brought about by this economic situation. In a sense, it's only been in the last year or two that we've seen the full range of possibilities that could emerge as a result of our failure to deal with threats when they arise in the world in a timely fashion. Now, if you look at this economic crisis, it of course has two elements that are connected and which also relate to what we're seeing today in Ukraine and other places. Now, the first element is, of course, the very basic one, financial power in terms of defence. You all know that defence spending across Europe has fallen. Even in America, it's fallen, mainly because we've made a decision that we can't afford it anymore. Now, the consequences of that have been laid bare. If you are not spending a minimum of 2% of your GDP on defence, you start making choices, you start losing capability, you start having to give up things that were once almost axiomatic in your military potential. And that's what's happened to Europe's armed forces. They have become enfeebled over time, and belatedly we've recognised that if we do wish to confront threats abroad, that we will need to actually once again ramp up our defences in order to make that happen. And I think you saw some of that at the NATO summit recently when this issue was debated extensively and people were able to once again raise the issue of having 2% as a bare minimum in terms of targeting. I mean, there are many other problems in the defence realm. A lack of, if you like, interoperability, a lack of our ability to procure things in a sensible fashion. But at the core of it is one of spending money. If you don't spend money, then you can't really be a credible force. And that is, I think, in the minds of some of our leaders, do we really have the credibility to take on, say, Russia or other threats if we wish to do so in an aggressive fashion? To give you a classic example, when we did the Libya intervention a couple of years ago, we discovered that, in the British case, one of the ships that was actually rescuing British citizens was on its way home to be decommissioned. So you can see the impact of defence cuts on the ability of countries to intervene and do things abroad. But the second issue that's just as important is psychological. So in times of economic crisis, in times of retrenchment, the last thing your citizens want is foreign adventurism. You know, you've got to deal with crises at home. The idea of going abroad and starting a new set of conflicts seems to many to be a false waste of resources when there is so much economic dislocation at home. Now, I think we've slightly come out of that a bit in Britain now, but you saw the impact of that last year, the Syria crisis. We had a vote in Parliament where, astonishingly, our House of Commons voted down the option of doing anything, if you like, in Syria, despite the Prime Minister having vigorously been in favour of it. And we did so because members of Parliament were receiving sackfuls of letters saying, don't go to war in Syria in any way, shape or form. So psychologically, there's been a form of isolation. Of course, America has seen this even worse than us. Last week's speech, when Mr. Obama finally said that we're going to be engaged in a long-term strategy to combat ISIS, was really the first time we've seen in his entire presidency a willingness to commit force of any kind abroad. Because this psychological feeling, based on what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, the history of this, added to the economic problems, meant that people really were not, buying into the idea of foreign policy and a vigorous Western stance in this path. And the problem is even worse for the European countries, because, and of course Britain is European, but in the context of mainland Europe, because their economies are not recovering. So if you look to what's happening in the Eurozone, for example, even Germany is suffering economically, and this plays into this idea of not wanting to antagonize forces. And in particular for the Russian case, you will all be aware of the economic dependence issue. There's a serious economic dependence on Russia, particularly on the energy side in Europe, and this has also compromised our ability at a time of economic problems to tackle Russia. And it goes beyond that as well. You'll know of, in certain cases, access to capital markets in London, the sale of French warships. All of these things economically play into a Europe which can't afford at the moment to be choosy about its decisions abroad. Now, of course, I will argue, and many others will argue, that Russia poses a security threat, not just to Ukraine, not just to the Baltic states, but indeed to all of Europe. So that will have to be balanced in the longer-term thinking with economic growth, economic potential, and how to deal with these economic interests. And slowly you're seeing, with the various sanctions, the move in European political mood, despite the problems, to actually tackle the seemingly bigger problem of a Russian advance against European interests. But the final factor I want to bring in is also the competition, if you like, for attention that the Ukraine faces in Western media. And if you look at what happened over the summer, it was quite an extraordinary summer in terms of news content, because for every time you had Russia's aggression in Ukraine on the news, you then had it knocked off. So it was knocked off, for example, by the Hamas-Israel conflict. A lot of interest in that, of course. And now you're competing here with the rise of ISIS, a story which I have to tell you directly affects many European countries because of the presence of our citizens who have gone to fight as jihadists in the Middle East and who are threatening, or have in some cases, returned already to our homelands. So for us now, we have a very immediate national security threat posed by the ISIS situation, which demands attention in a way that the longer-term threat of Russia perhaps doesn't. So it's going to be a challenge in that sense to keep the idea of Ukraine and its need for support in the West because of its westernizing process and its democratic process to stay in those news headlines and to enable support to occur as a result. So the challenge here, I think, is to link into values, link into ideas, and to have to keep Ukraine on the front pages, if you like, of Western newspapers in order to remind the West of why we have an interest here and why Mr. Putin is very dangerous. And I'll end really simply on a point that struck me. This is my first visit to Kiev, and the first thing that you notice about this city is that it's a European city. And I say that because there's a lot of feeling that actually this isn't Europe. A lot of Europeans would say this is Russia, this is different. Well, it's not. This is Europe. This is the same as any city in East Europe, indeed in some in Western Europe. And as a result, I think it's important to get that message across as well, that Kiev is a European city, Ukraine is a part of Europe, and we can't abandon it as a consequence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. I have a question with respect to the possible implications for, I know you're an expert on Anglo-American relations, and right now there have been some discussions and negotiations with respect to the transatlantic free trade agreement, investment agreement, TTIP, the so-called TTIP.
Yeah.
And the goal of Putin, in a way, was to actually distance Europe from the US, and they've been doing that, quite a great deal of that in the spring, all the spy scandals in Germany and other things which could be done covertly. And apparently the whole political situation right now in the US and Europe, that a lot of people believe that actually Putin has played the role of that Cupid, that he's injected that love between Europe and the US. However, basically the fate of that agreement is still unclear. And do you think that the current political situation in Europe caused by this insecurity in Europe can actually undermine for that agreement to go forward? Or what could be the implications for that in this context?
Well, I think you're right that, in a sense, Putin has played Cupid. It's been one of the things he has done is united us in a way that we'd never have been united had this aggression not occurred. So from that perspective, that is correct. But look, when it comes to free trade agreements, while insecurities are always there, and that plays into political arguments. So if it is a time of economic crisis in various ways, then you always get left-wing arguments for protectionism, which is, of course, the big sort of set of issues that are against the TTIP from being concluded. At the same time, if you look at what's happened in France, the left-wing government's abandoned its policies, or is starting to abandon them, because it realizes that doesn't work. I think economic reality is going to bite in Europe. People understand that free trade in a globalized world is the only solution, and that just as free trade within the EU has led to development of economies and of growth, so a transatlantic free trade agreement is the next shot in the arm that we need in Europe to do this. But it's a fight, it's a political fight. It's not necessarily about sort of insecurity, it's about rising over that insecurity and making sure the politics therefore fits with the economic need.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mendoza. I'm having a question for you personnel. Do you believe that Europe today has a very clear picture on Russia? Does Europe realize that the war that is going on in Ukraine is orchestrated and supported by Russia and waged against European values? Because, sometimes when we witness all these ping-pong games between France and UK, with France blaming UK for creating lavish conditions for Russian market business, and UK vice versa for selling missiles from the side of France. So do you believe that Europe realizes the consequences of these games, and does Europeans, do they have the clear picture on Ukraine?
Well, I think, in a sense, the arguments that you're seeing about who's created the monster indicate they do understand the problem. So if France is blaming Britain, if Britain is blaming France, if Germany is being blamed for having, not been tough enough, it indicates that everyone recognizes the problem is there, it's real. This isn't an imagined issue. This is no longer a question of, sort of squabbling ethnicities, this is an aggression by one country against another. And I think that part is very well understood. I think, what happened in Crimea shocked people, but they weren't used to that kind of aggression in Europe in 2014. I think what's happened in eastern Ukraine has now reinforced that shock and allowed people to, if you like, Crimea happened very quickly. This was a speedy, a short, sharp shock, and it took a while for people to digest what had happened. But now they see the pattern. The pattern has started. What is happening today, what is happening with threats to Russian ethnic communities in the Baltic states indicates there is a pattern, indicates there is an aggressor on the loose, and that he needs to be kind of curtailed in some way. And that's why we've responded with several waves of sanctions. I think we are aware of the problem. Where it is Where you're going to get the difficulties in the last part of your question, which is how far does this stretch in terms of an analysis and understanding that it's really our security that's also under threat here? Because you could make the argument to say, well, this is just a local neighborhood difficulty. This doesn't affect us. But we've seen through history, we've seen examples of when people have used these ethnic arguments before, that it never stops there. It starts to develop further. Where's the next argument? Where's the next target? And when suddenly you start to talk about NATO and EU countries, then you've got a direct threat to your interests in that regard. So I think people are slowly getting there. And the more that he rattles his saber, the more that they're going to understand the nature of the problem. But we're in a pretty good place, at least from that perspective now.
Alan, you mentioned that perhaps Britain is not that much dependent on the Russian energy as some other countries in Europe, like Italy and Germany and others. However, London and Britain is benefiting a great deal from the inflow of the Russian money, which comes into the financial industry. There are approximately 30 billion worth of assets owned by the Russian oligarchs in the UK. And I think UK in itself could do much more to actually put more pressure on Russia. However, your government has chosen actually to do it through a coordination through the EU, which is very often is not as strong as it could have been. Do you think your government should do more, to put more pressure on the Russians? You know, they are enjoying their luxurious life, as Elena mentioned, in London. Their kids go to schools there. At the same time, they are sponsoring the Russian aggression in Ukraine.
No, you're quite right. The linkage between London and Russia in particular is strong, and there are clearly things that could be done on an individual basis to make life more unpleasant for those who are connected to the regime which is perpetrating these crimes. But I just make a joke, actually. I mean, you know there's an independence referendum in Scotland on Thursday, so maybe we'll lose all our oil and gas at that point, and we'll have to import more from Russia on that side. But look, it affects us, so nonetheless, you know, we are part of the EU. If other countries in the EU are under attack from this, and when we suffer as well. Equally, if there is an economic consequence of some kind of embargo or whatever, we do feel it. We trade with Europe. Therefore, in the interdependent world, you have to be you have to acknowledge if your trading partners suffer, you will suffer too. That doesn't mean, however, that you can kind of be if you like weak in the face of a security threat. And I think we've recognised that, and we've been. I think, to be fair to the government, they have pressed quite hard already for a range of sanctions, but clearly that needs to go further. Because of London's importance as a financial centre, we do need to push the EU on the financial side of sanctions in particular, because financial sanctions are only going to work if America imposes them, if Europe imposes them, and frankly, if others further afield do as well. The one issue I think that could be very effective straight away, which David Cameron has spoken about, is the imposition of a SWIFT transfer ban. If that were to come about, I think it would have a very immediate impact on business straight away. But look, we are pushing. I think we're one of the more aggressive countries in Europe on this score. There's a lot of other countries who I think you need to look at, who need to explain why they are not putting European security interests above narrow and immediate economic interests, because the two are connected. If you allow Mr. Putin to continue with his aggressive push, ultimately you're going to become more dependent on him. At some point, when an aggressor keeps on pushing, you have to break the dependence, even though that's painful.
Thank you, Alan. And just one last question.
Sure.
Recently I've noted the tendency that some European countries, or frankly speaking, ethnic groups inside those countries, like Catalonia in Spain, like Bavaria in Germany, Scotland in Great Britain, and Venice region in Italy, they tried to separate from their countries. And my question, does the Ukrainian crisis gave them an example that self-devoted people can separate from countries, or the Ukrainian crisis showed them show that people should unite to just to combat the situation, to combat terrorists, probably?
Well, look, no, it's a good question because, of course, you have firstly the issue of how the separation occurs. I think, thankfully, that all the separatists in Europe, now at least, it wasn't always the case in Spain, for example, with ETA, and we've had issues with the IRA in the past, of course, have given up armed struggle in that kind of context. So we at least, we're not looking to create, spontaneous uprisings to split free from countries. It's going to be a process, an orderly process, and I think actually what's happened in Scotland has been the model for how this works. There was a local election where the Scottish nationalists won the majority of seats. As a result, that gave them a mandate to ask the UK government, can we have a referendum? The UK government said, okay, don't see why not. There's been a process, we'll go with that path, and now we're arguing it vigorously. And it is a vigorous art. If you've looked at the debates, it's been a full-throated, all the issues have been debated, and you can't say on Thursday when they vote that it hasn't been properly argued and discussed. I don't think anyone minds that kind of debate about separation or independence. And the other question linked to that is we don't, of course, have the same level of threat. There isn't an aggressive neighbour right on the doorstep of any of these regions threatening them. I think if there was, your argument would make sense in the sense of understanding that people are stronger together in that path. And by the way, that's one of the reasons we originally had union in Britain. So why did Scotland and England come together? Well, the English interest was to stop hostile powers from using the northern border of Scotland to actually create pressure, particularly the French, on England. So the union made England's security better, and for the Scots' perspective, it made economic sense and brought people together. So I think if people can see the positive in union rather than just looking at the negative, often that can bring a good result. Well, I think it united people against the idea of Russia. I'm not sure it necessarily has united them about wanting to be part of states. But that again comes down to the ability of those states to argue the case for staying together. Spain should be arguing very strongly for why Catalonia should be part of Spain. We've been arguing very strongly why Scotland, should stay part of the United Kingdom. It's all about the arguments in that sense.
Many thanks, Alan, and enjoy the rest of your stay here and have a safe flight home.
Thank you very much. Thank you.